A little while back I spoke to Josh Frydenberg, who of course is the Parliamentary Secretary from the Liberal Party, whose job it is to cut all the red tape. I didn't talk to him too much about red tape, but a lot about the budget and about Malcolm Turnbull. Have a look at this. Frydenberg, welcome to the program.
Good evening, nice to be with you, Richo.
Now look, I'm amazed really at the reaction to your budget. I mean, still 3.5 weeks on, it is simply not going down well. When do you think you can start to cut through on this message that you needed to do all these terrible things?
Look, I think we are starting to cut through with the budget. You're right, the reaction or the immediate reaction was not what we had hoped for, but I think it's dawning upon people that this is a good budget, and we've got two key messages to sell, Richo. Firstly, we are paying back Labor's debt. On Treasury's numbers, if we're able to get these measures through the Senate, we will pay back $300 billion of Labor's debt over the next 10 years and save the taxpayer about $16 billion a year in just the interest on the debt bill alone. The second key message in this budget is that it builds growth, increases productivity and helps create jobs. And we're doing that through a trifecta of measures. First, record investment in infrastructure, $50 billion of federal funding into infrastructure, particularly roads. Second, record spending on education, apprentices, people doing diplomas, and of course the Future Fund for Medical Research, which will spur innovation.
Apprentices, they seem to think that they've lost a tool allowance. I mean, and you're telling me that they've done well out of it. You haven't convinced them at all.
Oh no, that's not right at all, Richo. In fact, apprentices for the first time are going to get a HEX or a HELP type of loan from the Commonwealth up to $20,000. And the evidence is that a lot of apprentices are actually not finishing their apprenticeship. So we're saying if you finish your apprenticeship, then you won't have to pay back 20% of that loan. But our thinking is, why should the taxpayer fund somebody who wants to go to university but not provide the equivalent sort of support for someone who wants to be a carpenter or a brickie or a plumber?
No, but I agree that for them the cost of buying tools is always something that holds them back. They had an allowance and you're taking it off them.
No, we're actually providing new funding for apprentices and they do get a far better deal. So you better speak to some of our the apprentices that we talk to as opposed to the ones that you are.
Well, I was watching a group with them on television. It just seems to me that you are struggling with this message on a whole range of fronts. And I'm not sure that it's going away easily. As an example, let's just look at retail trading. It's obviously there's been a big drop since budget day. You must be worried about the reaction of the populace in general because they're keeping their money in their wallets.
Well, Richo, you would have seen the national account figures just coming out just a few days ago, and that indicated that growth has risen to 3.5% for the year, that exports have risen 4.8% in the last quarter. Housing starts, particularly in your state of New South Wales, are increasing for the first time in decades. So there are some very positive messages. In fact, we've created 100,000 new jobs since we've come into office. We believe that in this budget we are taking the tough measures that are required, the tough measures that the Australian people expected us to take. That's why they elected us after the disaster of the Rudd and Gillard governments. We don't shirk those responsibilities, but we do have to convince the Senate.
Yeah, but you've got to convince more than the Senate. I mean, when the crunch comes, you've got to convince, and it looks to me like about 60% of the nation, that there's a good reason for their living standards being lowered because you never did tell them that's what was going to happen to them.
Well, Richo, I do think that the Australians understand, or the Australian people understand, that we have been living beyond our means. The fact is, we are spending as a government $180 million a day more than we are taking in revenue. In fact, we're spending $1 billion a month just in our interest bill alone. We have a situation where pensions are the largest single government expenditure item of $40 billion a year, 10% of the budget. And when you look at the demographic time bomb that this country's facing, where we'll see a doubling in the number of people over the age of 65 as a proportion of the population in the coming decades, we have to take this corrective action. If we don't take it, Labor never will, and the Australian people will go further and further into debt. I mean, one of the issues in this budget has been around fairness. I mean, I ask you, Richo, how fair is it that this current generation leaves the next generation, children and grandchildren, a $25,000 debt bill each? Every Australian man, woman and child will have a $25,000 debt bill that they'll have to pay back if Labor's spending promises weren't cut back.
I can answer that quite easily. I mean, I have never disputed the need for tough measures, but it's the fairness question that gets me. The reason I have been opposed, very strongly opposed, to a lot of the stuff in the budget is that you've whacked people who really are, living bare bones anyway. You're whacking families who've got no money in the bank, don't holiday in the south of France. They're lucky to pitch a tent in a caravan park. That's the best they can do. They're not living high off the hog. They don't go to restaurants. A big day out with it for them and the kids is McDonald's. I mean, you can't go to them, take $5,000, $6,000 a year out of the 80 grand, 100 grand family and think they're going to thank you. They're not, because you never told them you'd do it.
But Richo, what surprises me about the statement that you just made is that you were a member of a reformist government, namely the Hawke government. And what you did as a Hawke government was what we are trying to do now. You introduced co-payments on Medicare, and Labor introduced co-payments on the PBS. The last Rudd government increased the pension age from 65 to 67. We now, by 2035, want to take it to 70. Jenny Macklin and Wayne Swan changed the indexation for family tax benefits away from male average weekly earnings to the CPI. Exactly what we're trying to do now with pensions. The Hawke government introduced a indexation of the fuel excise. The Keating government, the Hawke government, introduced deregulation of our university sector. These are the very measures that we are doing now, and the hypocrisy from the Labor side has to be called out. Has to be called out not just by me, but by people like you, because if we don't take these corrective measures, we will be bequeathing the next generation a massive legacy of debt, and they deserve better than that.
Look, as far as I'm concerned, I've always been a supporter of co-payments. Always. I tried to break the idea of the universality of Medicare when I was health minister. I got nowhere in the Labor Party because they've been absolutely committed to that universality and still are. I can't blame them for that. That's a very, very deeply held belief for them. But when it comes to the family tax benefits to which I referred earlier, what I'm irritated about and why I can't support it is there were other things you could have done. And that $20 billion you referred to, if the budget's in so much strife and you've got to have co-payments, why wouldn't that $20 billion or a great part of it go towards taking money off, taking the deficit down, rather than taking very, very needed dollars off battling families? I mean, I reckon you've got an enormous job trying to sell that.
Well, let me explain to you on those co-payments for Medicare. Firstly, Medicare 10 years ago was just $8 billion. Today, it's costing the taxpayer $19 billion, and in the next decade or so, it will be up to $32 billion. So it's increasing quite exponentially. But the issue is there is a safety net. That safety net affects concession card holders. Richo, do you know how many concession card holders there are in Australia today?
I don't know the number, but I know there's a lot. I think it's certainly well north of 1 million, but that isn't your problem.
No, Richo, it's well north of 8 million.
Well, I don't care if it's 15 million. It doesn't make any difference. Your problem is convincing them. And so far, you've failed dismally. I mean, I'm not saying you personally, Josh, obviously. But so far, I look at the polling evidence, and it doesn't matter whether I'm looking at the published polls or the private polls that you've taken or Labor have taken. They all give you the same message. People aren't wearing it.
And I hear what you're saying, Richo, but I do think there is a positive and necessary message to sell out of this budget. Not just about paying debt, but putting in place new measures to stimulate growth and job creation. And that is around infrastructure, that's around education innovation, and that's around boosting workforce participation. If we didn't take these measures, and there are safety nets, I mean, over 8 million concession card holders will have their Medicare co-payments capped at just 10 visits. That's the reality. But if we didn't introduce this price signal, we would see Medicare bills run up exponentially, and that would be an additional cost to the taxpayer when we don't have the money in the bank to pay for it.
But your job, Josh, is not to convince me. Your job is to convince the mob. And I mean, let's face it, we've spent the last week talking about whether or not Malcolm Turnbull wants to have a crack at Tony Abbott. That's been the main discussion in Australia's newspapers, radio and television for a week, hasn't it?
Well, it certainly took the media's attention for a few days, just like, you know, Winks did and Cigars did, and a bit of harmless singing and dancing and attacks on family members of both the Prime Minister and the Treasurer. They're all distractions as far as I'm concerned. Malcolm Turnbull's
it's one hell of a distraction, Josh, with great respect. It's one hell of a distraction. I mean, ever since the argument with Andrew Bolt, it went on to Alan Jones, it went on to the 7:30 report. It had 4 days in a row of being the major story at a time when you're trying to sell a budget.
And, you know, you're speaking the reality of the situation just then, but what I'm saying to you is that Malcolm Turnbull is a vitally important member of our team. He's got a big job to do with the NBN, and he was right to put to bed, you know, those false accusations that were levelled at him that he was somehow concocting a leadership challenge. He wasn't.
Yeah, but wait a minute, it's a matter of how far you go. By doing that, he did exactly what Rudd used to do to Gillard. Here's Tony Abbott on his trip overseas. He stands up in France to do a press conference, and every question is about Malcolm Turnbull, not about what he's doing over there. And by the way, the D-Day commemoration is an enormously important event in the life of this nation and a lot of others. But it was all about Malcolm. And I don't know how you sell a budget when you've got that sort of a problem going on.
Well, it's a bit rich for you to compare Malcolm Turnbull to Kevin Rudd, because it's no such comparison. You know, Kevin Rudd was out there day in, day out, undermining his leader. Malcolm's an important member of a cabinet that is right behind Tony Abbott.
You want to read my column on Friday, because it'll explain what the similarities are. But moving on, you've got your Prime Minister overseas, and I must say that it's been difficult to know what he's doing because of all the noise back here that you say is not being done to impede him, but it certainly has done that, hasn't it?
Well, the Prime Minister hasn't put a foot wrong since becoming the Prime Minister and embarking on these overseas trips. I mean, firstly, he had to put the relationship with Indonesia back on an even keel after those spying allegations that dated back to 2009. He took the largest ever business delegation to Asia when he went to Japan, Korea, and then to China. He came out of that trip with 2 free trade agreements that Labor could never get, both with Japan and Korea, and we're on track to getting one with China. And now he's just made a visit to Canada, the first Australian Prime Minister since 2006, to go to that important bilateral partner. So he's doing a very important job on the international stage. And what I found very interesting was that Kim Beazley, a doyen of the Labor Party, pointing to the fact that the Americans are now looking to Tony Abbott for advice and guidance about how to deal with some of the issues and the challenges in Asia. And then you have Tanya Plibersek, who's the foreign policy spokesperson for the Labor Party. She's really on a foreign policy training wheels, because she was out there making partisan political points which were completely unfounded when Tony Abbott is out there batting for Australia and getting results.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to say that he's made a botch of that trip. I think he's doing his best in a difficult environment, made much more difficult by events at home. But look, I've got to leave it there, Josh. It's always a pleasure talking to you. I might say you're defending the budget a lot better than your leaders. And I thank you for tonight. We'll talk to you soon.
We can disagree on that. Thanks, Richo.
Okay. Josh Frydenberg in Melbourne. I'll be back in just a moment.